Welcome back to the Daily Dose, my friends. We're kicking it off with day number 336. We are still in the book of Hebrews. We started the book of Hebrews yesterday. If you have not already, go back to the video from yesterday, go down in the description, click on the link, and we have got a video that walks us through a lot of summary type information, right? Got a good summarization of the book, and it's got a cool little animated video that goes with it. You'll learn a lot from it. Go back and check that video out. You can find a link in the description from yesterday's Daily Dose video if you haven't watched it already. So as far as today goes, Hebrews 3 and 4, that's what we're cooking with. We also have Psalm number 26 as our devotional side item. Okay, but we're just going to be looking at Hebrews 3 and 4 in today's video. So what do we have? Okay, we have got, in the previous chapters from yesterday, we were looking at how Jesus was greater than the angels, right? And now we start off this section with it being said that Jesus was greater than Moses, right? It says, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has a greater honor than the house itself." Okay, that's interesting. So here it seems to be speaking of Moses as part of the creation, part of the house, and Jesus is being referred to as the builder, right? The one who made the house. And we see multiple references to that, including earlier in Hebrews, how Jesus existed before everything was made. We read about how everything that was made through Jesus, okay? And here we just read a little bit more about that. So anyways, from there, we go on to the next section that talks about a warning against unbelief. Now, I did a very detailed video on this for the last Chaotic Serenity, a handful of days ago, right? Go back and check that out if you missed it. I'm going to comment on just a little bit, but I'm not going to go into too much detail because we've got a lot to cover here. It says, "Today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion," right? And that's a quote from the Old Testament, speaking of the Israelites when they rebelled and how they hardened their hearts. And then in verse 16 of chapter 3, it says, "Who were they who heard and rebelled? Were they not all those Moses led out from Egypt? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies perished in the wilderness? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed?" So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. So that's a stark warning, but I speak a lot more about that in the video from Chaotic Serenity on Monday. So go check that out if you're interested. But from there, in chapter 4, we start off where the author of this book, this letter, speaks of a Sabbath rest for God's people, right? So in the Old Testament, there was this Sabbath, okay, a day, and sometimes a year, that was to be kept holy, a time of rest, okay? But listen to what it says. It says, "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands," right? So here it's talking about, I think, entering a more permanent rest, entering an eternal rest, entering a heavenly rest, right? "Since that promise still stands, let us be careful that none of you are found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed." There is so much to be said just right there, okay? So much to be said right there, okay? It says the message they heard was of no value, right? So there was a message preached. That message was heard, okay? But what did the hearers do with the message? Did they value it? Right? Did they value it? And I think that there is kind of an unspoken tie between belief and valuing, right? Belief and cherishing. True belief will value the gospel, right? You can have some people that say, "Yeah, I believe that Jesus died for my sins. Yeah, I believe I'm going to heaven." But if the person says that, but they don't value that, see the value in that, see the importance and the treasure found therein, then I would question their belief. Not that it's my place to question anyone's belief, but I'm just trying to tie two things together here, right? I think that the biblical implication of belief is not simply a head knowledge of a fact, but it's a head knowledge of a fact that has a value associated with it, a treasuring of said information, right? I think those things are kind of tied hand in hand when we talk about belief and faith from a biblical perspective, right? So it goes on there and it says, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day," right? So, and what this is talking about is, Joshua was leading the people into the promised land, okay, where they could presumably rest. Some people think that the whole concept of the Israelites crossing over the Jordan into the promised land, that's kind of a metaphor for when we die, us crossing over into heaven. But I don't think that's the case, right? I think that the Israelites crossing over the Jordan is really more of a metaphorical representation of us coming to faith, right? Because once they crossed the Jordan, it wasn't just a time of rest. That's when they really had to go to work. They had to start clearing out the land. They had to start building. They had to go to battle. They had to start taking over territories, fighting battles, fighting wars. Their faith was tested. Not that it wasn't before, right? But you see what I'm saying? When they crossed over the Jordan, they weren't entering into some grand state of rest. They had to get to work and do a lot of really, really hard stuff, right? Um, and I'd like to think that once we cross the other side of death, for those of us who are believers, then when we come to heaven, I'm thinking we're not going to have to work and toil and fight and go to war, right? I don't think that's going to happen. So that's why I say I think that the metaphor for crossing the Jordan is really more of coming to faith, right? Because when we come to faith, that's when the Christian walk really begins. That's when the testing of our faith really begins. That's when the Christian battles we fight really begin. So I'll go back and read that again. If Joshua had given them rest, i.e., if bringing them to the promised land had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So look, the author is saying, look, there still remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And I believe the implication is for that is that this Sabbath rest is eternity in heaven, right? So it says, again, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Okay? But I think there's a double meaning here, right? It seems that anyone who rests from their works rests in God. And I think that could be speaking of resting from our works in regards to salvation, right? Because the Old Testament was all about the law. People had to obey the law in order to make themselves righteous, in order to cover their sins, right? People had to work to obtain, okay? But here it seems that God is saying, look, anyone who enters God's rest, and I think that could be looked at as a metaphor for entering his rest, entering salvation, entering a relationship, getting saved, right? Anyone who is saved also rests from their works. In other words, doesn't stop doing them, but rests in the sense that it's not all about doing the works. It's about love that flows from the relationship that occurs through that faith, right? Anyways, the book is closed, or not the book, but our section of the book we're looking at today is closed where it talks about Jesus being the great high priest. Okay, it says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness. We have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet did not sin." That's encouraging, isn't it, friends? Right? If Jesus had not come down here to live as we live, someone could say, well, you know what, God, you tell us that we need to obey. You tell us to obey the Ten Commandments. You tell us not to be a drunkard. You tell us not to commit adultery. You tell us all these things, God, but you don't know what it's like. You've never been in our shoes. You don't know how hard it is after I've come home from a long day of work and I feel rejected at work. I may feel rejected at home, and I go to that bottle, to that alcohol, to try to give myself some relaxation and to give myself a rest and to drown out the sorrows of the day. God, you don't know what that's like to feel that rejection, right? And I'm just using that as a hypothetical example. That could be said in theory, probably not rightfully so, because if God created all of us, quid pro quo, he created our emotions, our feelings, and he would know exactly how that feels. But I think in an even more relatable way, he understands in the sense that Jesus came as a man, and Jesus did have to go through that. Jesus can relate, right? Because he was tempted in every way, as we are, except he did not sin. So he came down here and beat us at our own game, right? That's kind of what the writer, the author of Hebrews is saying here. And then it goes on to say in verse 16, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So he's kind of saying, look, we have a God who can relate. Jesus has been there, done that, and he got the t-shirt, right? He won. He beat us at our own game down here on earth. So because of that, let us approach God's throne with grace and confidence, right? So in other words, if you're having a problem, if you're having a struggle, approach God's throne with grace and with confidence, because the person whom you are approaching knows what you're going through. The person you are approaching, the God that you are approaching, can relate and understands the pain that you may be going through, right? So that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Those are encouraging words, friends. Those are super encouraging words, and that is all I've got for y'all for today. So, hey, thanks for your time. Thanks for being here. And until we meet again, deuces.